Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to this lecture. We are looking at another one of the Catholic letters. In this case, we're going to examine First Peter. So, starting off here with the authorship and the date, and there's an image of Peter preaching in the catacombs in Rome. First Peter is, of course, attributed to the Apostle Peter, but Peter as the author is a matter of dispute. So, how is it a matter of dispute? Well, consider again what Luke wrote in the book of Acts regarding Peter and John, but how he described Peter as an unlearned, uneducated man. And this letter is very, very polished Greek. So could Peter have actually written such a letter? The short answer to that is no. But somebody else could have written the letter while Peter dictated it. And you have a reference to that at the end of the letter, which I'm going to read. Through Silvanus, whom I consider a faithful brother, I have written this short letter to encourage you and to testify that this is the true grace of God. Stand fast in it. Your sister church in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends you greetings, and so does my son Mark. Well, the argument here is that Silvanus is actually writing the letter and Peter is dictating it, and it would have been dictated from Rome. The reference to Babylon is a code word for Rome, as of course the Roman Empire was who controlled Judea, Israel, and Jews would refer to the Roman Empire and the city itself as Rome. But there's also an argument against Peter being involved here because of whom the letter is to. The churches in Bithynia, Cappadocia, etc., that would Peter have actually had anything to do with those churches? So that's also been an argument against Peter having anything to do with the letter. But um, if Peter did dictate this letter, then this letter could be considered the first papal encyclical. But if he did dictate this letter, then it would have been dictated from Rome during the years of 64 to 67 CE/AD, and reference there at the end of First Peter that I just read. But if Peter did not dictate this letter, then it was dictated from Rome by somebody, or written by somebody pretending to be Peter dictating it during the years of 98 to 117 CE/AD. So the letter was written from Rome. That much we can say for certain. And in terms of the dates, the ones at the top, the 64 to 67, that would, of course, been when Christians were persecuted for the first time under the Emperor Nero. But the bottom dates, the 98 to 117 CE/AD, that was when Christians were persecuted under the Emperor Trajan. But look a little bit here with the opening of the letter. To those who have been destined and chosen, and I'm going to read this opening and then I'm going to make some comments on it. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, Bithynia, who have been chosen and destined by God the Father and sanctified by the Spirit to be obedient to Jesus Christ and to be sprinkled with his blood. May grace and peace be yours in abundance. Okay, to those destined and chosen, destined and chosen. Well, that leads into a question. How much say do we have in this? I often use the opening of the first letter of Peter to bring into the topic in my intro to philosophy class the issue of free will versus determinism, libertarianism versus determinism. Determinism, of course, means that there is no free will, that everything is determined essentially usually by mental capacity and or environment, so nature and nurture. Whereas free will, of course, holds that we can carve out our own destiny if to just a certain extent. And I also use this passage to reference John Calvin and his particular theology, the 16th century French Protestant reformer John Calvin, and his teaching on predestiny. But how much say do we have on this? There's passages that relate to both determinism and free will throughout the Bible, throughout the New Testament. The passage that I read, I reference, or I just mentioned a moment ago that I use that in referencing Calvin, and I'll reference Calvin a little bit later. But there are passages that do show a freedom of choice, you could say, like I think of the parable of the banquet in the Gospel of Luke, and also the bread of life discourse in the Gospel of John. But might as well look at here, two understandings of Christian justification. Justification relates to salvation, even though they are two different terms. I would say that Christians, certainly within traditional Christianity, universally agree on the idea of salvation, which is that Jesus comes into this world, he dies on the cross, and he rises from the dead. And in doing so, he destroyed sin and death. And, essentially the view is, raised us to eternal life, that understanding. So I'd say that's pretty much universal across the board within traditional Christianity. But there are some different understandings regarding justification. Justification essentially stating, how is one right with God? And so the two understandings, I'm going to put them both on the screen here and explain. But the first one you have is what is called synergism. Synergism is the notion that God gives grace, which humans can choose to respond to or not. So in this case, you have free will. Now, the other one is monergism. Monergism is the notion that God gives grace, which humans have no control over, no free will. And let me have a quick sip of water, and I will give an example relating to both here. Okay, let's say that you have the train of salvation, and the train is going down the track to its destination, which is ultimately heaven. And no external forces, outside forces, can stop the train. But an internal force can stop the train. You can. You can say, I want off. And the train will stop and let you get off. Now you can come back on. You can come back on the train, but you can get off. That point of view is synergism. That is essentially a cooperation with God's grace. God gives grace, but you can choose to either accept it or reject it. Freedom, free will. John Calvin, by contrast, would say no. Calvin is in the monergism side. And this relates heavily to his teachings of irresistible grace and predestiny. From Calvin's point of view, you do not choose God, God chooses you. If you are one of God's chosen, you're one of the elect. If you're not one of God's chosen, you're one of the damned, and there's nothing whatsoever you can do about it. And of course, if you're one of God's chosen, you're not going to walk away because of his teaching, Calvin's teaching on irresistible grace, that it's not possible from Calvin's perspective for you to walk away. Now, you might be wondering a little bit with what I just said, because I mentioned how, from Calvin's perspective, you don't choose God, God chooses you. If you're one of God's chosen, you're one of the elect. If you're not one of God's chosen, you're one of the damned, and there's nothing whatsoever you can do about it. Some of you might be wondering, well, what about the notion that Christ died for the entire human race? Well, Calvin maintains that Christ did die for the human race as a whole, but only the elect get to actually receive the benefits of that death and of that grace. So look a little more here with some of the themes and contents of First Peter. Well, the main theme of First Peter is to deal with early Christian persecution, whether this took place under the Emperor Nero, which if it did is when Peter lost his life, along with Paul, or the Emperor Trajan. And essentially, it's a letter to give hope to Christians, whether under Nero's persecution or Trajan's persecution. One notion here is how offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God. You are a royal priesthood. I mentioned with the letter to the Hebrews that one of the traditional understandings of baptism is that when you are baptized, you are a priest, that you share in the priesthood of Christ, which the author of the letter to the Hebrews holds is superior to the Jewish, because Jesus is a priest in the order of Melchizedek. And that notion is referenced here in First Peter. Offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God. Lots of things could be considered a spiritual sacrifice. I think of the celebration of the Eucharist, the Holy Communion, that the Eucharist, the Holy Communion, is traditionally understood to be a sacrifice in two different ways. One is that it represents, in an unbloody manner, Christ's one sacrifice on the cross, and the other is that you offer yourself in a spiritual manner to God during the celebration of the Eucharist, that you join to Christ's one sacrifice on the cross. Another is that while the Gentiles may regard you as evildoers, be respectful around them. Your good deeds will show who you truly are. And I think of this with Tacitus in his work, where he references the persecution of Christians under Nero. And Tacitus, he wasn't a fan of Christianity. He referred to it as a superstition coming out of Judea, and the man who started it was executed by Pontius Pilate. So there certainly would have been that attitude, but the author of Peter is saying that even though the Gentiles may think of you as bad people, be respectful around them. Your good deeds will show you who you truly are. And the end is near, be prepared. Again, this gives hope to Christians in moments of persecution. Well, that's essentially it that we have for First Peter. So if you do have any questions, please send me an email. Till then, take care.